It's a day that shook the nation, a moment that exposed the deep divisions of a country torn apart by war and social change. May 4th, 1970, Kent State University. A protest against the Vietnam War turned deadly when National Guardsmen opened fire on unarmed students, killing 4 and wounding 9 others. But what led to this tragic confrontation? What was happening behind the scenes? Today we're going to explore the story behind the story of the Kent State shootings, a tale of politics, protest, and the struggle for freedom of speech. Hello, my name is Brian Smith, and thank you for joining me as I uncover the events that culminated in one of the most pivotal moments in American history. The 1960s and 70s were tumultuous times in the United States. The country was fighting an unpopular war in Vietnam that was instigating a wave of protests. In 1970, tensions came to a fever pitch when tragedy struck on one college campus. On May 4th, members of the Ohio National Guard shot into a crowd of anti-war protesters at Kent State University, killing 4 students and wounding 9. To understand the context of the tension, we need to look at the background of not only the war, but what was going on in the United States in 1970. The United States had gradually increased its support for South Vietnam in order to prevent communism from spreading into Asia. Richard Nixon had won the 1968 presidential election based partly on his promise of transferring combat duties from U.S. soldiers to the South Vietnamese in their fight against the Viet Cong. On April 30th, 1970, President Nixon seemed to be betraying this promise about reducing U.S. involvement in the war when he announced that he sent troops into Cambodia, where the Viet Cong had its headquarters. Opponents of the war interpreted Nixon's announcement as a step backward, and it immediately prompted anti-war protests across the country, in particular on college campuses. I was living in Upper Sandusky, Ohio at the time, less than 2 hours from Kent State University in Kent, Ohio. The campus was a relatively unlikely setting for the dramatic events that unfolded over the span of 4 days leading up to the tragedy. Compared to nearby Ohio State, the Kent State student body was generally less liberal and more blue-collar. However, it's thought that outside agitators helped escalate the violence and intensity of the protests. As protests became more heated, the Ohio National Guard was summoned to Kent. These guardsmen became the center of the controversy for their decision to fire into the crowd. Many of these young men were no older than the student protesters themselves and had joined the Guard in order to dodge the draft. But the real story behind the story of what happened at Kent State begins a few days before the tragic shootings took place. It begins on Friday, May 1st, the day after President Nixon made his announcement about sending troops into Cambodia. On May 1st, 1970, students at Kent State held an anti-war protest, just as many other students at schools around the country did. Kent State students gathered on the campus commons at noon and buried the U.S. Constitution. This symbolic act was meant to represent how Congress was violating the document by waging a war that it had never officially declared. Before the crowd broke up, students decided to meet again for another rally on Monday. That night, the town of Kent was restless. After visiting the bars and becoming increasingly rowdy, crowds built bonfires in the streets, broke windows, and threw bottles at police cars. The worried mayor of Kent, Leroy Satcham, declared a state of emergency in the town and called Governor James Rhodes for help. In an action that inadvertently exacerbated the situation, Mayor Satcham also closed the bars. As a result, patrons spilled out into the street and joined the rioting crowds. Finally, the police dispersed the crowd using tear gas and encouraged students to return to campus. Tensions only increased on Saturday. About 5 p.m., Mayor Satcham asked Governor Rhodes to dispatch the Ohio National Guard to Kent. He had heard threats and rumors circulating and feared more riots like the night before. Before the Guard arrived, a crowd of about 1,000 protesters gathered around the ROTC building on Kent State's campus and burned it to the ground. Authorities never found out who was responsible for the fire, and protesters cut fire hoses to prevent the fire department from putting out the blaze. The National Guard reached Kent by 10 p.m. and broke up the crowd. On Sunday, May 3rd, the college campus was filled with guardsmen. However, the atmosphere was surprisingly friendly and relaxed, and many students chatted with the guardsmen. But all that changed when Governor Rhodes arrived in Kent and held a press conference during which he called violent protesters, quote, "the worst type of people that we harbor in America," unquote. The governor also suggested that he would do something unprecedented and seek a court order to declare a state of emergency. He never did make the declaration, but most of the guardsmen and university officials assumed that martial law had taken effect. This misunderstanding gave the Guard control over the campus. Sunday night, protesters rioted and threw rocks at guardsmen. Several arrests were made. The stage was set for a rally on Monday, May 4th. The rally had been planned since Friday, but on Monday morning, university officials, with the impression that the campus was under martial law, issued 12,000 flyers to notify students that all rallies were banned. Student protesters defied the warnings and began gathering in the Commons around 11 a.m. By noon, the Commons was filled with 3,000 people. Yet only about 500 of these people were active protesters. Another 1,000 were not actively participating. They just came to show the support for the rally. Approximately 1,500 more lined the perimeter of the crowd, watching the rally and milling around it. It wasn't exactly an anti-war protest. Rather, evidence suggests that students were there to protest the guardsmen on the campus. The highest-ranking officer, General Robert Canterbury, fruitlessly ordered an end to the rally, calling out to protesters with a bullhorn as he was driven around the Commons in a jeep. As the crowd became increasingly rowdy and threw rocks at his jeep, Canterbury ordered his men to load their weapons and use tear gas. The guardsmen pushed the protesters past the Commons and up and over the steep Blanket Hill into the Prentice Hall parking lot and a practice football field. Finding themselves cornered in the field by a fence, guardsmen retreated back up the hill. When they reached the top, 28 guardsmen out of about 70 turned and began firing their guns. Although most fired into the air or the ground, some shot directly into the crowd. In the span of 13 seconds, guardsmen fired between 61 and 67 shots. 4 students were killed by the gunfire. Allison Krauss, Jeffrey Miller, Sandra Schuer, and William Schroeder. Schuer and Schroeder were not participating in the protest. They were merely walking to class. 9 more people were wounded, one of whom, Dean Kaler, was paralyzed. The tragedy could have led to even more bloodshed had it not been for Professor Glenn Frank, who was acting as a faculty marshal to keep peace during the protests. He successfully pleaded with the students for 20 minutes not to provoke the guardsmen any further. Although these are the facts of what happened, we don't know why it happened. What prompted some of the guardsmen to fire into the crowd? Investigations and drawn-out legal battles attempted to answer this question. The news of the Kent State University shootings shocked the world. The school was closed for the rest of the semester, as were hundreds of other colleges across the country. The next weekend, 100,000 people gathered in Washington, D.C. to protest troops being sent into Cambodia. When singer-songwriter Neil Young saw the photos taken at the scene of Kent State, he wrote the song Ohio in commemoration of the tragedy. The Nixon administration seemed to point fingers at the protesters for provoking the guardsmen. Nixon's response to the shootings was simply, quote, "When dissent turns to violence, it invites tragedy," which struck many as cold. Nixon's Vice President Spiro Agnew said the tragedy was, quote, "predictable," and the president's speechwriter, Ray Price, expressed sympathy for the guardsmen, quote, "a bunch of scared kids with guns." According to a Gallup poll, most of the American public believed the protesters were primarily to blame. The guardsmen who shot into the crowd claimed they had done so in self-defense. They felt their lives were in danger. They testified that the protesters advanced on them in a threatening way that warranted shooting. Some historians who investigated the shootings have accused the guardsmen of conspiring to shoot into the crowd before they retreated back up Blanket Hill. A presidential commission that investigated the matter concluded that the tragedy was unnecessary, unwarranted, and inexcusable. And a 1970 FBI investigation into the shootings found that the guardsmen were not in danger and they had fabricated their defense. The case went through court in several trials. Judge in the federal trial dismissed it early on because of the weak case brought against the guardsmen. An Ohio grand jury put blame on the university officials and protesters, but not on the guardsmen. The civil trial was appealed several times before it was settled out of court in 1979. The victims and the families of the students killed received a collective sum of $675,000, which the state of Ohio paid. The reparations came with a signed statement from the guardsmen in which they expressed their regret of the tragedy. No official apology was ever issued. Today, there's much debate about who is to blame for the Kent State shootings. Nevertheless, all parties agree that it was an avoidable tragedy. The Kent State shootings left an indelible mark on American history, a stark reminder of the power of dissent and the consequences of unchecked authority. In the aftermath, 4 students lost their lives. Today we remember the 4 students who died: Jeffrey Glenn Miller, Allison Krauss, Sandra Lee Schuer, and William Knox Schroeder. Their memories live on, symbolizing the struggle for peace and justice. The incident galvanized the nation, sparking widespread protests and strikes on campuses across the United States. It fueled the anti-war movement, pushing the country to re-examine its involvement in Vietnam. Today, the legacy of Kent State serves as a poignant reminder of the importance of protecting free speech, the need for accountability, and the enduring impact of young voices demanding change. The story of Kent State is a powerful testament to the impact of individual actions and collective voices. Hopefully, their sacrifice is not in vain. This has been the story behind the story of the Kent State shootings. This is part 1. Please join me for part 2. I hope you have found this story as fascinating as I did. My name is Brian Smith. And we are history. Thank you for listening.
Soldiers and Nixon's